Hi everyone, today I want to show you how I draw a swan that was commissioned by a woman off the street. She asked about the price of paintings and ordered a swan on a blue lake. I'll need these acrylic paints, but I don't think the yellow will come in handy, and terracotta too. Let's see, I'm dividing my canvas with this kind of grid. This is for anyone who might want to try to draw a swan, but actually I'm going to get straight into the painting. I don't start with a pencil sketch. That's it. Well, the primer, because when you apply the paint afterward, it kind of muddles it all. The pencil muddles it, so I immediately start with painting, but I intentionally made the grid in case someone else wants to try to draw a swan. Here we go. I'm mixing white and blue paint with a dab of black to make a blue-gray. I'm coloring almost the entire canvas up to the point where the swan meets the water. I added more black. The swan creates ripples spreading out. I'm roughly sketching them. Look where the swan's neck is. I even go over it to make it look natural, as if there are really ripples, because if we stop at the white, where we will paint the neck, it will look artificial. The shadow is contributed purely black. At the edge where the swan's tail is, and there is a sheen, yes, picture a swan on a lake. It would cast its shadow on the water, and that shadow must be a super light blue, beige, very light white. I've just sketched it now, and later I'll make it brighter. Look, advice for beginner artists. If you want to highlight a drawing, you need to contrastingly darken the contour and brighten it next to it. That means there must be both dark and light spots. This is not something taught in art school, since I didn't study to be an artist. It's just my observation. To highlight a detail, you need to either lighten or emphasize it with black dark. And don't be afraid of vivid color. Firstly, I'm going to cover this piece with a layer of epoxy resin around the swan and create 3D waves, but that's for the next video. Here I explain in detail how I'm going to paint the swan itself, and make sure you replace your water and your napkin frequently. I'm flipping it over now as I record this in real time. I didn't change the water in this video, but it's better to change the water before you start to paint the swan. I'll take a wide brush now and get into the details of the swan. It is white in the pics, but there are shadows, and I mixed this mustardish mustard yellow with white for the detailing on the head and neck up to the chest and the feathers, and later I will lighten it up like this. It's easier to paint lighter shades on a subdued color than the other way around. Now I am making dark spots on the tail, and again I remind you, don't be afraid to darken and make it contrasting. Even if you think it will look loud, you will make light spots later on. It will soften your composition. Look at the brush. I barely dip it in water because I paint quite intensely, and if the brush is too soft and too damp, it will release water into the canvas. And I've already mentioned a few times in my videos that if a droplet runs down the canvas, it creates a runnel and the paint will run through it with bald patches. So look, with gray, blue, black, blue, and white, I made these kind of spots under the wings. That is on top. I will just detail the wings with white. And the closer you are to the edge, the less sweeping your brush should be, but just short strokes. Shakis's strokes shouldn't be too flamboyant. They should be short. I mean, their longest feathers are near the tail, and as they move closer to the chest, they become thin and narrow. I sketch the light spots on the head, and then I use a light gray with a dash of mustard for shading. The shadow from the neck also falls on tellets, which, by the way, is all about playing with shadows and drawing them out. Don't ignore it. Make sure to draw it, because just like an animal's eyes, even if you mess up somewhere else on the body but nail the eyes, it will make it look alive. The shadow works the same way. Don't be afraid to draw it. It gives your painting a lifelike quality. Now, in Swan's case, the eye isn't very detailed as it transitions from the black beak to a small black dot. You can't get too creative with it, but when you're drawing, remember that we're approaching this as non-artists. People who can't really draw and haven't been to an art school. But there are little tricks that give us, as laymen, an idea of what it's supposed to be. Like, even if you're doing a simple sketch, which is called an underpainting, where you just make some random spots, if you then add some more defined elements. For instance, I will draw 1 or 2 feathers, actual feathers. I'm not going to cover the entire swan in feathers because I'm not a fan of hyperrealism. This is an art piece after all. It's like an artist's signature, reflecting how they see and interpret the world. Through what colors, through what brush strokes. Hyperrealism, on the other hand, is essentially a printout of a photo. Just print a photo on canvas and voila, hyperrealism. You'll have a perfect replica of a swan. So, getting back to underpainting. You start with an underpainting and then you add more dimension with pure color. Just add in more detailed elements more clearly. Take your time with it. At this stage, the painting is essentially done. It comes down to how meticulous each person wants to be, how finished you consider it to be. Right now, it's pretty much ready to be sold. It's at a stage where someone could buy it, and I'm sure the client would be happy, but I want to add more details. And I would advise you to do the same. Once you've done the underpainting, step back a few meters and see what else you want to add. And you know what? Sometimes you don't immediately notice certain things when you're painting. You might not initially see the glimmers or the thin lines, but as the painting progresses, the puzzle pieces fall into place. For instance, I didn't notice the transition from orange to red on the beak, or the glimmer at the bottom where the wings meet the water. Those details only became apparent later. Why does that happen? Anyway, once I finish detailing the swan and the painting is dry, I'll mix the epoxy resin. I'll film that in another video to give you a more in-depth look. I'll also create the waves around the swan using the resin. Once the epoxy is dry, I'll enhance some parts of the swan by adding more volume and brighter colors. See, I just added some white feathers to give the swan more depth than the epoxy. You can also use this approach for the water. Sketch in some faint patterns. They represent the light reflecting off the swan. Remember what we initially discussed? Well, now the painting needs to dry before we can start with the epoxy resin. And there's your light. And then we move on to epoxy.